Our next topic is biodiversity. These notes are going to be very quick, very simple. The Bozeman science video that goes along with these notes as well is pretty quick and simple, and hopefully he'll do a better job of explaining it. If not, you have the resources now to go ahead and look on YouTube or Google anything that might not make sense, but I'm going to go ahead and go over it. So, biodiversity, the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So all it is just what makes things different in the natural world. All right, so bio means living, diversity, we're diverse, so living diversity. All right, living differences. So there are three main types of biodiversity. We can have genetic diversity, diversity in our ecosystems, and diversity in our species. All right, so obviously genetic diversity, we're here talking about DNA, so differences in genes in a population. So each one of us is an individual, each one of us is different. We're made 50-50 from mom and dad's genes to make our own. All right, so we have differences in those genes in different populations. Our ecosystem, we have a variety of habitats. All right, so different habitats are going to produce different organisms in a sense, because these organisms are going to have to be able to adapt to live in that habitat. All right, so that's where we also get different species, so differences between these populations. All right, now the main thing to know about the main differences of biodiversity is, unless it specifically says due to genetic diversity or due to a variety in habitats or some type of natural disaster or something that happens in the ecosystem, always assume that it is species diversity, which gives us biodiversity. All right, so the differences between populations is what drives biodiversity. Now, how's biodiversity measured? There's three main things we're going to look at. So we have richness, abundance, and then the biodiversity index. I'm trying to keep this very simple. If you were to take an ecology course, they go way, way more in depth than this. There's actually a lot of math involved in ecology, looking at populations, but we're going to try and keep it simple. So the richness of a population is the number of different species. All right, so how much diversity, the more rich it is, and that's a good thing. The abundance, all right, this is the distribution of a species. So it's typically a percentage. What percentage of that environment has that type of species in it? And then lastly, our biodiversity index. This is where if you take the number of species in a population divided by the actual total number of organisms. All right, so think about that. Number of species, okay, total out of all of the organisms. You do that division, and you get your number, and that gives us our index of how healthy a population is. The closer to 1 that this division leads to, the healthier the ecosystem. All right, so that means it's more balanced. We have some species that are going to affect biodiversity. There are 4 main types that we're going to talk about. So we have a keystone species, an invasive species, indicator species, and an endangered species. Now, a keystone species is critical to the healthy function of an ecosystem. A keystone species, all right, they're called keystone because when you're building any type of structure, typically a building, think of a brick building. If you use a keystone, all right, it's the one stone that kind of fits everything together. So this keystone species, some examples in a marine ecosystem would be sharks. All right, sharks are keystone species. They're usually apex predators. So they eat a lot of the different organisms in the ocean, and they balance those marine populations. There's no one population that is higher than the other because the sharks keep them in check. All right. Another one that you wouldn't probably realize of a keystone species would be a sea otter. All right. So sea otters eat sea urchins. Okay, that's one of their favorite foods. And sea urchins eat kelp, which is a type of algae or seagrass, okay? So if these sea otters don't eat the sea urchins, if they're not around to eat the sea urchins, then the sea urchins can take over a seabed, a seagrass bed, and deplete the seagrass in a matter of days, which all other organisms that need to eat that seagrass too are not able to do. So sea otters are very important. If they're taken out of the ecosystem, it's going to have a very negative effect. So that's what a keystone species is. Next is an invasive species. So these are species that are not native to the area. They are introduced somehow. They outcompete natives, meaning that they have no natural predators, all right, which is very important. So there's nothing depleting them, and they're going to take over an area, okay? So we talked about an example of this is the lionfish down in the Keys. Every year now there's a big hunt in the Keys to kill all of these lionfish because they're taking over our population. Next is indicator species. These are very sensitive to changes in ecosystem, so they indicate to us that something's not right. So one indicator species we've talked about is corals, all right, coral reefs. That is indicating to us that there's ocean acidification going on and that there's a lot more CO2 dissolved in our oceans as bicarbonate, and that it's causing negative changes in which is helping fuel climate change. And then lastly, we have endangered species, all right? And as most of you know, these are in danger of extinction. One organism, if you want to look it up, that are pretty cute, they're the cousins of manatees, is it's called a dugong, D-U-G-O-N-G. I might have mispronounced that. But they're kind of like manatees. They have a little bit more squish face. It's like a cross between a manatee and a dolphin. But they're an endangered species. There are a lot of marine mammals that are endangered, as well as sea turtles. And you can go to World Wildlife Fund, and they have everything there if you want to look into it. All right. So there's threats to this biodiversity. So the things that are going to threaten these species, okay? So loss of habitat. All right, if we have a loss of habitat or pollution, we could lose our keystone species, all right? It's going to cause them to be endangered species. And if we have an invasive species come in, then they're also going to help push out organisms from their habitat, all right? Pollution, we can see indicator species will let us know if there's pollution present. That introduction of invasive species, again, they are invasive species, and they could eliminate keystone species, endangered species, and or enhance endangered species, and cause indicator species to show some effects. And then, of course, change of habitat due to climate change. This is another threat that could bring about all of our four main types of species that affect biodiversity. But there are ways that we try to help this process, all right? So to help preserve biodiversity, one of the big things we have here in Florida is ecotourism. And what that is nature tours, okay? And they encourage conservation and sustainability. So here in Florida, some of our more commonly known ones is the Florida Keys in and of itself, all right? The Florida Keys is the third largest barrier reef in the world, and it is protected by the National Marine Sanctuary. So, oh, you hear my dog barking in the background, I'm sure. Another area that is protected is the Florida Cavern State Park. That's like the underwater caves that you can go in, you can swim into. So those are just some forms of ecotourism that we have people come to Florida, and while they get to snorkel or scuba dive or participate in these ecosystems, they're encouraged to conserve them and sustain them. Another thing we have, which we've talked about before when we watched Racing Extinction, was the Endangered Species Act. All right, so this is going to help protect endangered species, and by forcing that there is no hunting or development of projects that affect the species. All right, so these are two very important things that we have in order to help preserve biodiversity.